Hello, everyone. So my name is Rio. I am the director, manager, lead, I guess you'd call it, of the humanities department at Hamilton Education. So I run our ACT, SAT reading and writing, history, language, all that kind of stuff on the humanities side. Today we're going through the reading section of ACT Test 495. So we're going to go through every passage and do an overview of every passage, going through what problems there were in the passage, how we navigate it, and then we'll go through every question as well. So, in understanding why the correct answers are correct, why the incorrect answers are incorrect, and seeing how these question types might show up on additional passages or additional tests in the future, and seeing crossover between the ACT and the SAT. So, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and begin by overviewing passage one, which is a literary narrative, and then proceed with all the rest of all 36 questions and four passages of the ACT reading. All right, so this first passage here, as with every ACT, is a literature passage. Okay, so these are going to be, different from all the other passages on all the, rest of the ACT reading because this is fiction, right? It's going to be a narrative, a story. Okay, so what does this story tell? So we start off learning a little bit about this character who is not our narrator. Okay, Oneida. So we find out that our narrator is somebody who is not omniscient. Okay, I believe the family had a place on Lake Simcoe. Okay, so notice how much this narrator is saying, I believe, or I think, or I suppose. Okay, all of these phrases demonstrate that our narrator is somebody, right? Somebody who's writing about all this. Okay, so we're learning about Oneida and her father who runs a bank. Okay, in this relatively seemingly small town in wherever we are. Okay, so Oneida goes to a private school. She's from a richer family. Her father, Horace Janssen, is a little bit money, has money. And, we are learning a little bit about this period in the 1930s. So, again, our narrator doesn't really know everything. They were in high school, but they can kind of remember what's going on. And basically, the idea is we're in a hard time economically, the hard times of the 1930s. And Horace Janssen, this man, is hearing about and investing in an idea about bringing back the steam-driven car. Okay, so again, this may have had one himself, right? It's all kind of like speculative. It's not, our narrator doesn't know these things for sure. She's just kind of speculating. Okay. So now we see that the bank has put up the loan in order to build this business idea of the steam-powered car's resurrection, which again is not totally legal, right? So Horace Janssen kind of like falls prey to these people who, seem like they have, money, who seem like they have good ideas because they're well dressed, all these sort of things. However, when our narrator goes off to high school and starts apprenticing as a bookkeeper, she comes home and finds that the bank had lost a lot of money as a consequence of this steam car scheme. Okay, so what then happens to Ida's father, Oneida's father, right, who our narrator is interested in? He gets a new job that is kind of sad. All right. He is made the bank manager of a bank in a tiny town where they don't need a bank manager at all. What does he do up there? He sits and he does nothing until it's time to be driven home. And who is his driver that drives him to and from work? Oneida, right? So then we get our final paragraph, which is very important. Okay. Our narrator sits and contemplates what it would be like to be Oneida in this situation. And no matter, right, how, pretty Oneida might be with her skin and hair, no matter how much things seem to be, working out. She has a laugh, right? The street seems to clear for her. Our narrator, nonetheless, somehow feels sorry for her, right? Because on the surface, she was too trusting. Okay, so ultimately, we have a narrator who lives in this town, or who lived in this town at the very least, through Oneida's childhood, while Oneida's father made a series of bad decisions as a bank manager that were likely illegal and lost a lot of money, and ultimately got a very sad demotion that he only was able to get because of his status, and which he took as a consequence of his pride, right? And then Oneida is his driver as a consequence, maybe, of her pride and dignity. Okay. So with that, we get through our first passage, and now we'll go ahead and answer each of these questions. Okay, so question one. If you missed this question, I would really highly recommend you go back and watch the full passage review, which is the video immediately before this one. Okay. Going through that passage, I talk a lot about what's going on that answer this question, though I kind of presumed that the narrator was a woman, although apparently he was a man. Okay. So either way, notice what I highlighted up here over and over again. I believe, I suppose, I believe, right? All of these things are ultimately referring or suggesting may, right? That there's a level of like possibility here that is like, maybe true, maybe not, right? He is figuring out everything that's going on. How do we know that he's just figuring it out? Well, he was in high school and he heard a little bit about some of the things, though he could imagine there was more. He lost some of the things because he went to apprentice as a bookkeeper and he's kind of out of the loop for a while, right? School with the rest of us. All of this is sort of like things that he's overhearing and memories that he has from kind of like just being around. So what is hearsay? Hearsay is basically sort of um, like you know, improper uh chance. Okay, it's like if you would say something that's hearsay, it's basically like kind of like eavesdropping, and eavesdropping in a way that like is likely wrong. All right, so hearsay in his own recollections is exactly what we have, and it's what we talked about in the passage overview. It really contributes to the tone, right? Are these details directly from Jansen? No, we know that's not the case because there's so much I think, I suppose, right? C is far too extreme, right? Just because the author is saying like maybe or possibly or I suppose, it doesn't mean that there's this entire thing was fabricated, entirely fake, right? Now, finally, D. Yes, he is around the events as they unfold, but participant is really important here and really wrong, right? We know he is not a participant because throughout this, it was other people that were involved in this whole scheme. Our person was not involved, our narrator was not involved in this scheme at all, right? Everything is overheard, which again is basically what hearsay means. So if you chose answer choice D, it's likely that you just didn't know what hearsay meant, or you thought participant was being used more flexibly than anything else. So that's how we would get to answer choice A for question one. Okay, so question two is asking about a literary device, which is called foreshadowing. Pretty much everybody knows what foreshadowing means. It's like something we learn usually in elementary school, but basically foreshadowing is what we would call a hint of something that's going to happen later on in a passage. So we are asked, which of the following most strongly foreshadows Jansen's downfall? Okay, so we can't presume it's an answer that just simply says he's going to pursue a business idea, that he has access to money, that people were coming up with ideas at that point in time. We need something that shows that he is getting bad information. He's basically being scammed. All right. So there's only one answer choice here that references being scammed, which is C, maybe not as quick as he should have been to smell a rat, right? So basically, in the context of C, we go up to this paragraph and it talks specifically about what's going to happen, right? Who got into the bank, right? Who knows if it was a single person, a cohort, maybe a friends of friends, maybe a stranger. They were well dressed and plausible looking, to be sure. Horace cared about appearances. He wasn't a fool, meaning like he didn't make a lot of mistakes. He wasn't an idiot to just listen to anybody. But maybe he wasn't smart enough, or maybe he was not, maybe he was too trusting to smell out a rat that would scam him. All right. So again, D, while we do know later on that the steam cars idea doesn't work, the fact that he had a steam car doesn't foreshadow that this business program plan isn't going to work, right? Could have been how it worked really great. Okay. The rat shows that it isn't going to work. B, similarly, right, is coming up with ideas necessarily suggesting that those ideas are going to be, you know, ones that fail? No, definitely not, right? So it's too far. And then finally, A, certainly not, right? Many people run banks that don't fall for scams. So the only answer choice here, which really suggests most clearly that a scam is going to take place, is answer choice C. All right, so the passage suggests for question 3 that in considering those Okay, so we're looking at question 3. The passage suggests that in considering who convinced Janssen to invest in manufacturing steam-driven cars, most people in town must have did something. Okay, so what did they do? Our correct answer is D, indulged in speculation. And let's talk a little bit about why. So what does it mean to indulge in speculation? That means to guess, right? To purely speculate because they don't know for sure who it had been. How do we know this? Well, when we go back up into the passage, we see a lot of speculation. So remember, our author is a member of this town, right? We see it was maybe a stranger. Who knows if it was maybe a single person, right? Certainly, they were probably well dressed and plausible looking. Okay. Later on, we see, the visitors who had promoted it had all disappeared, right? We see lots of speculation, meaning guessing what actually indeed happened. There's lots of uncertainty, right? Maybe is all over this passage. So that's exactly what we have here, right? We're indulging in speculation. We're guessing. C is too specific. It could have been an old cohort, but is it guaranteed like C suggests? No. B, some were friends of friends while others were complete strangers. That is, another possibility. Maybe a complete stranger, maybe some friends of friends, right? Because it's those maybes, we're not saying that each group has certain beliefs like B suggests. Rather, we're suggesting no one really knows and everyone's just kind of guessing. And then A shows far too much specificity. All right, so D is the only one which really prioritizes what this passage is emphasizing so strongly, which is the sort of speculative or guessing nature of the townspeople as to what happened with Janssen's steam-driven car scheme. All right, so question 4 is asking us to paraphrase something that the narrator says, which up here we can see is in hard times of the 30s, people were still coming up with ideas. You can be sure that men were nursing a notion bound to make them $1 million. That means men had an idea that they thought would make them $1 million. And in those days, $1 million was $1 million. All right, so what does all this mean? In the context, it means everybody wanted to get rich quick because everybody was struggling in the hard times. Right? People come up with ideas to get rich that they think would make them $1 million because they are struggling. So the correct answer is B here for that very reason. That puts that exact idea in language. All right. Now, we're talking about the 30s, not people in their 30s. Okay, so if you missed A, you fell for what we call a recycled language distractor, but we're talking about the 1930s. C, while this might be true, right? It might be true that men were making as much as $1 million a year in the 1930s. Is that what this paragraph is suggesting? No, right? Um, it is suggesting rather that people wanted to make $1 million. The people who wanted to make $1 million, who had a notion that they would be able to, are the people who don't have $1 million, right? So C is a true but irrelevant distractor. And then finally, D, this everyone should make us a little bit suspicious, right? That is what we call too extreme. Everyone was sure that they could take their money-making plans to Janssen. No. How do we know that? Well, because a railway bum probably couldn't get in to talk to Horace Janssen, right? So not every single person is going to have this opportunity. So that's how we get rid of A, C, and D and arrive to B for question 4. Okay, so question 5 is one of our few vocab questions on the ACT. If you are taking the ACT, you're a little luckier, right? Because the SAT has a lot of vocab questions, or at least the iteration from 2025. Um, and so the SAT has a lot of vocab. The ACT really doesn't, okay? But we still do see these sometimes. Okay, so question 5 is a vocab question. We're asking what nursing means here. All right, so let's talk about some of these words. So rearing does mean to nurse in a certain context, but we also need to make sure it fits, right? It needs to both fit the context and mean the same thing. So what does rearing really refer to? For the most part, rearing refers to raising something, particularly an animal, right? In order to bring it to like livestock, raising livestock in order to bring it to market, right? So someone might rear sheep or cattle or goats. Okay, rearing has another meaning, which means to rear back, right? Basically, like a horse might rear up, meaning stand on its back legs, or something might rear its ugly head, is a phrase you might have heard, which means to like lift it up and make it visible. But in this case, it has the same meaning as nursing, meaning to grow something from being little to being big. We're talking about like animals and livestock here, right? What we really want for this, right, when we talk about nursing a notion bound to make them $1 million, we're talking about cultivating, like they feel something, they're working on something, they have this idea in their head, right? This notion, this idea is in their head that they think is going to make them a ton of money. All right, so nursing a notion means they're like building it, okay? So they're not educating that notion. Educating doesn't fit here, right? It doesn't mean the right thing either. To be educating that notion would mean that they are teaching the idea itself. They're teaching something to the idea. That doesn't make sense. Nor does healing. Now, healing and nursing can mean the same thing, right? However, does healing fit here if you're to put healing in there, right? Healing an idea that was going to make them $1 million? No. So what does it mean to foster something? Foster means to tend to it in a way that you hope will make it real, right? So it is also like used in with like a situation of kind of like raising people or animals as well, kind of like rearing, but in a very different context. But here, fostering, to foster something is to like patron it, right? To cultivate it so that it comes to fruition, comes to be in the real world. So fostering works best. Rearing is really close, but the specificity of its meaning means that fostering is better than rearing for this question 5. All right, so 6 is a great question, exactly the kind that we are likely to see on the ACT or the SAT. The narrator speculates that whoever convinced Janssen to invest in a steam-driven car must have been something. All right, so this is going to be directly from the passage. So what must they have been? Well, where we look here, I'm just going to erase some of my annotation here because it's just a little bit too much. All right, it's kind of hard to read through. Okay, we know that it was not going to be a railway bump, right? Horace set store by appearances. We know that this man, the people who set this up, are going to be well dressed and quote unquote plausible looking. You may be sure. All right, so what does that mean? It means like these people looked like they must have had some money. They were well dressed because the appearance is something that really matters to Horace. All right. So is there anything wrong with an answer choice like A? No, right? We say that he set store in appearances, right? So the appearance of looking moneyed or affluent is important, right? We say that they were definitely well dressed, which is directly from the passage, right? So there's nothing wrong with A. I want to look at an answer choice that you may have chosen, like B, right? Wealthy. They may have appeared wealthy, right? But must they have been wealthy if they appeared wealthy? No, right? When the hard times in the 1930s, so, there's that. But more importantly, the passage doesn't say that the narrator doesn't say, I speculated that they were wealthy. They must have been wealthy. No, it must have been that they at least looked plausibly wealthy. That is a very different understanding than that they were guaranteed to be wealthy, right? D, this could make sense, right? But what does the narrator specifically focus on? The way that they must have looked. Finally, with C, well, while Jansen remembers the original steam-driven cars, we don't see that he is looking for other people who also remember it in order to invest. So for 6, if you chose B or D, you have to remember your inferences on these tests have to be based off the text, and they have to be what we would say unimpeachable. There must be nothing wrong with them. Our goal is to choose something that has nothing wrong with it, rather than something that is plausible but not guaranteed, right? A is guaranteed. B and D are both plausible, right? The person may have been wealthy, they may have been intelligent, but we know for a fact that the narrator believes that they were well dressed. That's why we prefer A for a question like 6. All right, so question 7 is asking us about a logical inference, right? Something that must be true based off of what we hear in the passage. So it says that we can conclude that the original steam-driven cars were something. All right, so what is in here? Okay, we see that the new model would be an improved version, the new model of the steam car, and it would have the advantages of being both economical and not making a racket. So the new one is going to be cheap and quiet, right? So that means, this is improved advantages. The old one was expensive and loud, right? Which is what A says. So A is correct for that reason. None of these other ones are specifically referenced anywhere in the passage. Luxurious, okay, sure, maybe because they're expensive, but do we know if they're durable? No, not in the passage. Maybe impractical because they got replaced, but were they unattractive? We wouldn't know because it's not stated in the passage. Finally, reliable and fast, is that anywhere in the passage? No. The only thing that is in the passage is that the new versions will have an improvement that makes them quieter and cheaper. So that means in the past, they were probably noisy and expensive. That's how we arrive to A for 7. We can always infer the opposite from things. That's a logical inference. Okay, so for question 8, if you missed this one, I have a feeling that you chose answer choice B. And I want to show you what word in B makes it incorrect. This word right here, entire. This is what we call a too extreme distractor. All right. So we know that maybe he put a little bit of money, right? There's some confusion, and that he may have put in some of his own money. But what do we know that he did for sure? He had dipped improperly into bank funds. Maybe the laws were not so tight back then, but he had also dipped improperly into bank funds. We know for sure he dipped into these bank funds. He may have used his own money, but it's unclear, which means we don't know for sure whether he used it, and the entire is too much, right? So we know for fact that he is using money from the bank improperly brought out. Okay, so that gives us C. A and D are not referenced. While we do hear about these towns in another part of the passage, it's not there. And we do know that Jansen's wealthy friends maybe were involved in some of this, but the more important part is that we know for a fact he had dipped improperly into bake funds, as we see on line 40 plus. So that's what we get to see for question 8. All right, so question 9, the narrator states that people assumed it was pride that drove Jansen to do something. Well, what we see, pride, as it was thought, chose otherwise, right? So this is what people are thinking, pride chose otherwise. Otherwise to what? His refusal, right? The fact that he didn't refuse is what demonstrated his pride to accept the job of a bank manager in the little village of Hawksburg, right? Even though they didn't really need one. So all of that gives away that our correct answer is B. All right. If you missed this question, I'm assuming that you didn't go back to the text. Question like 9 requires we go back to the text. Okay, make sure you see a question like this, you go back to the text. If you don't, you might think, well, it was his pride that led him to think, perhaps he could spend his money wisely and return it to the bank and no one would care, right? But that is not what the passage says. The passage specifically says pride right here, right? So that is where we need to focus. So that's how we arrive to B for question 9. That finishes up our first passage. With that, we'll move on to the second passage and continue going through every single question of ACT 495's reading section. Okay, so question 10 is a very classic ACT or SAT question in that the qualifiers give away a lot of the information that we have here. Okay, so the connotative meaning of a word like lament or critique is really important in order to understand what our correct answer is. So what does it mean to lament? That means to bemoan, to give another word that you probably don't know, means to cry about something. All right. So means to feel bad about it. It's something, lamentations are what people do sometimes when a loved one is passed. Okay. So to lament something means to really be sad and crying about something that is gone. Okay. Is that what's happening here? No, this is certainly not a lamentation of what's gone. This is the perspective of how early designers felt about early use of plastic. Okay, to critique, nor is that there either, right? It doesn't seem like our author nor the people here are upset about how plastic can make something look like streamlined or looking towards the future. All right, now, for C and D, exemplify and illustrate, both of those are totally fine, right? But then you look at this part of D, remained largely unaffected by new design trends. That doesn't make sense, right? New design trends even did come up to something like a pen, something that's been around forever. They were very impacted right now because they've been streamlined. So we've gotten rid of A, B, and D. Let's talk about why C is correct, right? Even the most mundane item, the most stolid item, like the most stuck in the mud item, everyday thing, could appear modern with plastics, bringing us to streamlining it. We're going towards the future here, right? So that's how we arrive to C for question 10. Okay, so now we move on to passage 2. So let's just overview this passage as a whole. Here we have what we call a paired passage. So paired passages sometimes freak students out. But ultimately, we go about making sense of what they're saying the same way we'd make sense of any other passage, right? So let's talk about passage A first. So passage A is talking about the early days of plastics from particularly the design side. Okay, so we're talking about designers specifically and their perspectives about plastics from the early days. So we see that there is a very particular aesthetic that is associated with plastics. All right. The aesthetic associated with plastics is kind of like streamlining, right? Creating a feeling of motion and speed in everyday objects, hurtling towards the future. All right. Now, why is this the case? Because we wanted something that was malleable, relatively inexpensive, and made for mass manufacture, right? Due to a sort of utilitarian, egalitarian gospel. But we hear from these designers there is a issue of plastics, right? Because they could make really good mimicries of things, as well as with unfortunate early experiences. Okay, so they're good at mimicry right here, and then we also have unfortunate experiences. Plastic is seen as, uh, you know, basically their adaptability and glibness, right? Meaning kind of like their casualness, undermine their capacity to achieve the dignity as legitimate materials. All right. So we have instances such as them falling apart, right? Plate that melts in hot water, raincoats that fall apart in the rain, toys that break on Christmas morning. Um, all of these things sort of undermine plastics' reputation, even though they start to get better, right? So we figure out polymer technology, but the damage to plastic's reputation had been done. So Passage A focuses at first on design and the reputation of plastic among designers, and then ultimately talks about its reputation within for consumers as a whole. Passage B focuses instead on how the plastics industry is going to navigate the sense of wary customers, right? Uh, so we have this important figure, Sidney Gross, who basically seems to think, right, we want to quit trying to convince people that plastic is not bad. It's a waste of money because really the more important perspective is to sell the manufacturer and basically just fill the stores because they will consume people will consume what was offered. Now, why? Because nothing succeeds like success. So, some instances of this show up later, right? We get some examples of how plastic started to become more pervasive because it just was simply more practical, despite a sort of general disdain and distaste and wariness about the material itself, right? So, a plastic juice pitcher is bouncing off the kitchen floor, right? Um, you know, we're not going to scratch the furniture anymore with our toy soldiers. Um, and eventually we see that because it becomes so pervasive, they become completely assimilated into their lives, right? So both these passages are talking about plastics. They're both talking about how plastics became a part of everyday use. And they're both talking about how plastic managed to either overcome or deal with or be subject to consumer preferences and thoughts about what's valuable about plastics, whether plastic is a good material or not to consumers. So now that we've solved the passages, time to move on to the questions. All right, so question 11 is asking for us to understand the main idea of a paragraph. Okay, so let's look at this paragraph here, which is about why designers embraced plastics, right? So from the mid-century on, design has been guided by an egalitarian gospel, a belief that good design doesn't need to be a lot of money, that mundane items can also be things of beauty. All right. So plastic, as we see here, is just perfect for that. It is the ideal medium. It is easy to make, cheap, and ready for mass manufacture. So the prevailing philosophy means the philosophy that already existed, right, that already was widespread, which wanted great things as cheaply as possible. Plastic perfectly matched this. It was the ideal medium for that mission. So A is correct for that reason. Okay. B is incorrect because the famous credos and slogans are not about that we see in paragraph 2 are not about plastic, but about the ethos of egalitarian cheapness as possible, right? Get the most of the best to the most for the least, right? Says, get the best thing to the most amount of people for the least cost. That predated plastic. That was the overall philosophy that plastic just so happened to match with really well. C, we don't see anything about a challenge in this second paragraph, right? Designers are really happy to have this malleable material. Malleable means easy to change, easy to form. And then finally, D, we're not talking about an artistic movement here, right? Mundane objects are wanted, but this rather than is wrong here, right? The passage explicitly states that beautiful objects can be mundane and mundane objects can be beautiful. So to prioritize one over the other would be to undercut the principal philosophy mentioned in this second paragraph, which is why we can arrive to A by getting rid of B, C, and D. All right, so question 12 asks for a reasonable inference from passage A. So remember, when we're making inferences on the ACT, or the SAT for that matter, we are not making an inference that we would maybe make in an English class, right? Our inference is not going to be one that is plausible. Rather, it's going to be one that must be true, right? So, in the 1950s, before the 1950s, plastic manufacturers had not figured something out yet. So the correct answer is B, and I'm going to point to which lines prove answer choice B, right? How to match the right polymer. Oops. So how to match the right polymer with the right application is something that was figured out during the 1950s. So plastics technology improved during the 1950s as they figured out how to match the right polymer with the right application. So if this is something that they figured out in the 1950s, what's a reasonable inference? Well, it's something that they hadn't figured out before the 1950s. If it took them until the 1950s to figure it out, it wasn't something that they solved before the 1950s. So that is why B is correct. All right. A is wrong because we know that they are already streamlining things earlier on because of all right here in the 1930s and 40s with plastics. All right. C, they knew that consumers would buy everyday items already, right? How do we know that? Because of right here, right? This is in the immediate post-war years. That's the late 1940s. And then D, they did know that designers would embrace working with plastics already, right? It didn't take them to the 1950s to figure that out. Why? Because we see designers liking plastic up here. So there's a specific reason why answer choices A, C, and D are incorrect. And we have a specific reason why B is correct, which is why we arrived to it for question 12. Okay, so question 13 is a really good example of how on both the SAT and the ACT, we have questions that are not officially word and context questions that nonetheless have really important vocab within them. Okay, so for example, pervasive as a word in answer choice D. Pervasive might be a word that you don't know. If you don't know what the word pervasive means, you might have a trouble or a hard time getting the correct answer here. So what does pervasive mean? It means that it is widespread in everybody's situation, okay? So having plastics everywhere, penetrating deeply into the material fabric of everyday life is a perfect synonym for what pervasive would be. Something that's pervasive would be a smartphone, right? Something that seemingly everybody has. It's used by everybody. Okay, so saying that the statement they had penetrated so deep into the material fabric of everyday life proves or refers to the way that plastic became pervasive to the extent that they were integral to today's every person's routine. right? Integral being basically like very well integrated, meaning an important, essential part of their daily routine. Everything is right with D. But if you didn't know what those words are, you might have some trouble. So hopefully you can get to D even without knowing those words by getting rid of other answer choices. So C, a threat to traditional ways of life. That might be something of a baggage distractor. It doesn't talk about that in this passage itself, right? B we know is wrong because they weren't preferred by most consumers to more conventional materials at the very beginning, right? And additionally, this isn't what's being referred to here. We're not trying to prove that they're preferred by saying they're everywhere. These lines here basically says that whether or not some people consider them second-rate substitutes or a sad commentary doesn't matter. They're everywhere. Okay, so it isn't to show that they are more preferred. It's to show that they just, regardless of whether they're more or less preferred, they're there, right? And then finally, consumerism isn't really being talked about here. We're just saying plastics are everywhere. This says plastics are everywhere, and D says the same thing, which is why we'll go with D for question 13. If you miss this, you're either falling for a recycled language distractor with B and C, where they talk about, uh, problems of modernity or less preference, or something like, or maybe a half-right distractor. So that's how we get rid of the wrong answer choices and arrive to the correct answer choice of D. Okay, so question 14 is one of those questions where a little bit of vocabulary is important, even though this isn't officially a vocab question. So knowing what disdain means is important here, right? So the sentence up here, which you can read, says ultimately that a sleepy householder had only to watch once in disbelief as a plastic juice pitcher bounced off the kitchen floor to begin accepting plastic in a practical way, no matter how strong their conceptual disdain for it. Okay, so conceptual disdain means a personal dislike, okay, or a general dislike. Okay, disdain means a distaste or dislike. So that's why B is correct, right? So basically, they're saying, imagine you drop a glass juice jug, it's going to break. But you drop a plastic one, it doesn't break. People are going to just like plastic more because it doesn't break for them, even if they don't like the idea of plastic, right? So that's exactly what B says. With A, how do we know that this is an advertisement? Might be a good advertisement idea, but we don't see it designated as an advertisement anywhere there. With C, how dramatically plastics quality improved between 1945 and the mid 1950s, we have to be restricted to passage B here, okay? Do we know whether, for a question like C, do we know how previously plastic juice containers were before the 1950s? No, we don't, right? The only one in passage B that's talked about that improves is those toy soldiers, okay? Finally, with D, biased people against plastic is the wrong word here, right? The things that would maybe bias people against plastic are primarily in passage A, but in passage B, we don't see that, so that's why we can get rid of D. Ultimately, and arrive to B. All right, so question 15, we're supposed to be focused exclusively here on passage B. Okay, so if we're talking about anything other than passage B for question 15, we're going to have an issue, okay? So why is C correct for passage 15? Well, we have this good instance of less durable, but also less destructive, which when we scroll up and when we read about these toys, we see even though there were brittle toys that broke on Christmas morning, they were superior in many ways. A toy soldier of modeled plastic could not scratch the furniture as easily as an old-fashioned lead soldier. So, even though some of them are breaking on Christmas morning, which is something that's actually referenced in passage A as well, we do have the happy other side of things, meaning they're also not destroying your furniture. So people seem to prefer or might prefer the fact that it doesn't destroy furniture, even if it breaks a little bit easily. So that's what leads us to our correct answer of C. We don't see kids preferring these toys compared to parents anywhere, so we can get rid of D. We don't know the cost, and we know that they break easily. So B doesn't make sense. We don't know if they're cheaper according to passage B, and we know that they're breaking easily, so we don't know if they're going to be sturdier than the other alternative. And finally, flexibility in detail is something that's not talked about with regard to toy soldiers elsewhere in this passage, anywhere in this passage. That's ultimately how we get to C for question 15. All right, so with question 16, we move to the portion of the paired passages where we're putting these two into dialogue with each other, these two passages. We are now synthesizing these two passages. So the first one asks about something that both passage authors do in order to support claims about public perception of plastics. So the correct answer is ultimately A. Why is that? Well, when we go up into passage A, we see how it was approved really quickly up here, right, by someone who urged fellow designers to use this notion. All right. And then when we go to passage B, we see quotes from Sidney Gross saying that plastic is not bad and how people perceive plastics. All right. So both passages talk a little bit about how plastic is perceived using the experts of people who wrote or used about plastics. All right. Do both passages analyze publications which promoted plastics? I don't see any publications mentioned in passage A. So passage A means that B is wrong. Okay, do we talk about concepts which were used to market plastics? Well, yes, but do we define those key concepts necessarily? No. And does that describe or show their claims about how the public views plastics? No. Right. So even if there's a little talk about using plastic to market it using this notion of speed in passage A, and passage B talking a little bit about marketing to the manufacturer, it seems like the main deal here doesn't refer to those, right? That's not public perception. Now, finally, D, to personify artwork or objects is not there. Remember, if we personify something, we're basically giving something that is not human, we're imbuing them or adding to them certain human-like characteristics, right? So that is how we get rid of B, C, and D, and ultimately arrive to A for this question 16. All right, so for question 17, I just always want to remind our students to go back to the text. The correct answers are always going to be in the text. So let me show you where we see inferior substitutes referred to in both passages. So in passage B, we see the notion that no matter how many people consider them second-rate substitutes, okay? So second-rate substitutes, inferior substitutes is referred to in passage B. We say that the public generally believes this, right? But they choose to ignore it once it becomes so pervasive. Now, do we mention inferior substitutes in passage A? Yes, we do, right? The growing reputation, oops, I don't want to do that so bad. The growing reputation of plastic as an inferior material because it imitates fake wood cabinets, faux leather recliners, right? So its mimicry capacity makes it get their reputation as an inferior material, which is also an inferior substitute, okay? So both passages talk about that. Now, what's wrong with some of these other ones? It was plastic expensive? No, it was not, right? Which is why we get rid of C. Was the artificiality of it unattractive? We don't think so. And then finally with A, it wasn't unattractive in design. Many people were trying to, as we see in passage A, make it beautiful. All right, so we need both passages to be in agreement for a question like 17, which is probably the trickiest part of a question like 17. That's how we arrive to D, though, for 17. Both of them say that plastic was seen as a knockoff, mimicky, bad, low quality thing. All right, so 18 is a very fair question, a good one. We're asking, which of the following statements best compares the ways that the authors use details about plastic toys on Christmas morning? So let's just go to where they talk about plastic toys on Christmas morning. All right. Here we see it in passage A, plastic toys that cracked on Christmas morning, right? As an unfortunate experience that exacerbates the reputation that plastics are bad. All right. So passage A says these plastic toy soldiers breaking on Christmas morning are a good example of why people didn't trust plastic at first. Passage B says, right, um, same example, brittle items that toys that break on Christmas morning, they are nonetheless superior in many ways. All right, so this guy is, clearly a shill for plastic, right? He's like, oh, they're much better. Why? Because they don't scratch the furniture. So how would we compare these two things? Both say that they are an example of early problems with plastic's quality and that they break too early, right? But from a different way. Okay, so they both say that they break. Um, so does Passage A think the toys are a good design? No, quite the opposite, right? It seems to say this is why people don't like plastic. All right, with B, um, it's talking about illustrating the popularity or the lack of practicality. Well, passage B does seem to think that plastics are practical, which is why we can get rid of B. And finally, C, the variety of plastic items. Well, it seems like only uh, passage A gives a list here about plastic items, right? And that's only to focus on ones which are kind of like giving a bad reputation to plastic. Then passage B, this is the only example that they give within that paragraph, which is how we arrive to D. And with that, we finish up our second paragraph, or our second passage, excuse me. And we move on to the rest of the passages in this ACT 495's reading section. All right, so the third passage from this ACT 495 on the reading side is a phenomenal passage, and it's a very tricky one at that. Um, I think it's also just well written and interesting in its subject matter. If anyone's ever heard of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you'll know that he's kind of one of the paragons of what is called magical realism. But more than anything, he's just truly one of the more famous and important and influential of the Latin American writers. So, why is this passage on the ACT kind of tricky in my opinion? All right, well, because its structure is unique. All right, its structure is not very straightforward. It borrows from a rhetorical strategy that we have a word for, a fancy Greek word for, called prolepsis. All right. Now, it doesn't exactly engage in prolepsis because it isn't saying something that it entirely agrees with for the sake of an argument, but ultimately it borrows that strategy, that rhetorical strategy. So, what is the structure and the strategy of this passage? Why is that difficult? Well, you'll see this first paragraph here. Our author says that Gabriel Garcia Marquez was driving from Mexico City to Acapulco when illumination hit him. He turned the car around, went home, and locked himself away for 18 months. Then, when he reappeared, he had the manuscript for 100 Years of Solitude in his hands. All right. So, like, that reads, anyone would read that and assume it were true, right? It would assume that the writer of this passage would think this is true. But then we see this paragraph and this paragraph undercutting that first paragraph has a really important word here. And then, right? So this part up to here is about correct, right? He had been, or about, not correct, but it's about equal to what the first paragraph is saying. It resembles it. Driving around when Garcia Marquez, as if in a trance, turned his car around and drove back to Mexico City. And here we see our passage author undercutting, interjecting. Now, up until this point of the story, mythomania hasn't been challenged. But then we see the biographer says, um, there have been many versions of this story, and that the one just related cannot be true. All right, perfect. Right. So, um, that line, the story that was just related cannot be true, is the most important line I could think of in this passage. Because now all of a sudden, this paragraph, which we read as very truthful, is actually a way of demonstrating the ways in which the author who we're learning about, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, was really good at creating self myths. All right. Um, Now, the rest of this essay proceeds from this point, right? It has uh we don't get any more kind of bait and switch or hard pivots for the rest of this passage, right? We see that the writer didn't do what we thought, right? He didn't live in total seclusion for a year and a half. He probably did go to Acapulco. He didn't turn straight around, right? Um, and it wasn't that he worked on a new book, it was that he was reviving an old one. So that undercuts the story. So now we learn a little bit about Garcia Marquez from this point forward. Why he was so interesting is that he combines kind of like the tone of Franz Kafka, who is, kind of a very, I mean, it's he's kind of impossible to describe because he's probably the one of the most important writers in world history in terms of his influence. With someone like his Garcia Marquez's own grandmother, right? Um, so we see that in fact, the way in which Garcia Marquez's own personal biography about the story of him writing 100 Years of Solitude is actually not too different from the book itself, 100 Years of Solitude, right? So, um, just because the miracle didn't happen in as it says it did, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a miracle, right? So, um, we see that this changed his life. Okay. Then we see, a little bit of a personal thoughts from Garcia Marquez, right? He says things such as if he hadn't left his isolated birthplace, perhaps he would be better of a person than he is now, right? Uh, he could have been somebody who would have been the character in one of his novels that, in fact, he would have never written. All right. So we're back to this term mythomania, right? Probably the most important, one of the more important words of this passage, right? Um, so uh, his stories, his essay, his novels, right, are kind of uh, you know, neither completely fact, neither completely legend, right? He tries to contort them in order to show something more, right? Which is the violence, the tragedy, the failure, as well as this carnival spirit, the humor, the music, and the art of Latin American people, right? Now, remember, this essay is not written by Gerald Martin. Gerald Martin is the biographer who's also getting a little bit of an analysis in this essay, right? Um, so Martin, the critic, Martin, the biographer, shows that, perhaps a little bit of darkness is what was important here in order to make this thing, in order to make Garcia Marquez work as a writer. Um, you know, Perhaps this is as a consequence, according to our passage author, of Martin's own sad biography. But rather than saying that Marquez's work is sad, it rather is just showing the sorrow that must lurk in life, right? Um, and perhaps a little bit of this melancholy is a good corrective for Garcia Marquez's own elaborate ironies when he's telling his own story about himself. So ultimately, this passage is tricky mainly from this big pivot that comes from the beginning and from the way in which we have to realize that this passage isn't ultimately just about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the writer. It's also about the biographer who wrote about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, whose name is Jerome Martin. If we can pick up on both of those things and understand what is being said about the both of our subjects, particularly Gabriel Garcia Marquez, we will understand this passage and, hopefully come away from it wanting to read a little something about from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's really one of the more important writers who's ever been. So with that, we move on to the questions themselves. Okay, so question 19 is a very important question here because if you weren't able to navigate and solve the problems of the passage itself, this question 19 is going to be very difficult. All right. So let's make sure we have watched the passage overview video in order to answer question 19. So if you didn't get 19 correct, it's probably because you didn't understand the passage. So watch the passage overview. Now, let's move forward to going through what is correct and incorrect here. Okay, so we're looking at just the first paragraph, right? So A isn't correct because the misconceptions about how Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote 100 Years of Solitude is not addressed at all in this first paragraph. And in fact, reaffirms many of those misconceptions, right? B is wrong because it's a little too far when we say writing novels. What novels does he talk about? Well, in this first paragraph, we hear just about his great novel, right? 100 Years of Solitude, his greatest novel. We don't learn about the way that he approaches writing multiple novels in this first paragraph. Finally, D, pretty clearly, you see this word childhood. We're not talking about childhood here. Okay, so C is the one that has nothing wrong with it. It does relate a story about Gabriel Garcia Marquez that Martin discusses in his biography, right? That this story isn't directly true doesn't mean that that's not the purpose of this first paragraph, right? This first paragraph is to basically show something that we will then undercut slightly. All right. So the biggest distractor here, I think, would probably be A. If you chose A, make sure you've watched the passage overview video. So question 20 is straightforward in that what we would call this question type is a detail question. And detail questions, we can always kind of tell when they have something along the lines of based on the passage, as seen in the passage, according to the text, something like that at the beginning of the question stem. We know that this answer choice is going to be directly in the passage. All right. Now, if you missed this one, you probably fell for what we would call a recycled language distractor, meaning the wrong answer choice that you liked has direct language from the passage, but in a wrong way. So for example, D, we see this word excessive melancholy. The writing contains excessive melancholy. And in fact, there is a paragraph that says here that perhaps there's an excess of melancholy. But when we see this excess of melancholy up in the passage here in this paragraph, is this referring to the writing of Gabriel Garcia Marquez? No, right? What is this writing? What is this excess of melancholy referring to? It is referring to instead Martin, all right? The biographer about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, all right? Another recycled language distractor, the local facts and legends in C. His novels do, in fact, borrow from local facts and legends. We see that here, right? But the word that I don't like in answer choice C is this too heavily. We have to get rid of C because he would need, in order to say that he's borrowing too heavily from local facts and legends, we would need the author to say something about the fact that he does it too much. But in fact, up here, we see the author just sort of says it's the perfect literary home for them, right? So I'll get rid of C. Finally, B, do we really learn about journalism compared to novels and preferring the journalism? No, I think B is probably the easiest one to get rid of. Now, for A, he considers Garcia Marquez to be a gifted writer. Where do we see this for real? Right? Well, right here. When he got into the car, he was a gifted writer. He got out, he was on his way to the Nobel Prize. Okay, so just make sure for a question like 20 that even if you are using direct language from the text to answer the question, you're using it in the proper way, right? You're not misinterpreting that direct quote. All right, so question 21 refers to this word's illumination, right? So this is not a word in context question, right? We're not asking what does illumination mean? We're asking how does it function? What does it refer to? What is it doing? Okay, so when we see it in line 4, right, and we see it later in line 34, both of these moments of illumination are kind of like an epiphany that led to the novel 100 Years of Solitude. All right. So he basically figured out his book. We know that the real story is that he was reviving an old book, but he figured out how to do it, right? What did he find? He realized how to tell it, okay? He was going to combine his grandmother and his one of the author, Franz Kafka, in style. Okay. So the illumination is not Martin's discovery. Okay. That's what's wrong with B. Is it true that the part of the illumination was about modeling his writing after Franz Kafka? Yes. But the moment of illumination was something that happened to Garcia Marquez, not something that happened to Martin, the biographer. Right? C, this suggests that the illumination belongs to the passage author. But is that true? No, the illumination belongs to Garcia Marquez. Even though Garcia Marquez does base his stories on local facts and legends, that isn't the big, moment of epiphany. Finally, yes, Garcia Marquez owns the illumination, right? It was his own. But had he yet completed 100 Years of Solitude when he had his moment of epiphany? No. He would take 18 more months in order to finish that novel. So that's how we arrived to A for 21. Watch out for recycled language distractors on a question like this. All right, so 22 is one of the more important questions for this passage. If you missed question 22, I want you to go back a few videos. I want you to watch my passage overview video, which describes the passage as a whole. We talk a lot about this particular line and what comes around it. All right. So go ahead and do that now, and then come back and watch the rest of the video for this particular question. So the passage most strongly suggests that a reader might be a little surprised, even disappointed on line 11, because if you're reading Martin's biography on line 11, you may have heard the fact that this story from the first paragraph in this quote, is how the novel that won a Nobel Prize came about, the novel being 100 Years of Solitude. Now, what does Martin say about this conventionally understood story, though? He says, and it's highlighted up here, the story related cannot be true, right? So this is what we find out a little bit later for C, okay? That's why C is correct. Remember, you can't look only at the lines that we're looking back on in order to understand the purpose of them, right? So go a little bit further to read the and then, all right? Now, A is just wrong. Okay, so one, he didn't even write in seclusion, we learn, right? That was mythomania. That was a bit of a lie. Nor is it critical of this fact, right? B, incorrect here because we don't get an analysis of his novels really much at all, other than that, he's what he's doing with kind of like making literary moments out of a mix of kind of mythy and real things. And D, it's not that we are wondering why he drove back to Mexico City. In fact, we find out that he really didn't even actually drive back to Mexico City. All right. So, question 22 is ultimately revealing the structure of the passage as a whole. If you missed this, watch the passage overview video and we will see it. All right, so question 23, we have what we call a detail question, right? So it says, according to Garcia Marquez. That means we need to go back to the part in the passage that specifically talks about Garcia Marquez's grandmother's fantastical stories. So we go back to this paragraph here, which is what talks about the tone of his grandmother's stories. So he says, she told fantastic stories, right? Fantastic not meaning in this case really good. Remember, fantastic has more than one meaning. In this case, we're using fantastic in the same way we would say the word fantasy, right? Fantastical. So she told fantastical, fake, or unbelievable stories as if they were true because for her, they were true. All right. There is the direct quote from this passage that explains something about Garcia Marquez and how his grandmother told stories. So that line directly relates to B. All right. He was imitating Kafka, not her. He wanted to be a successful writer, not her. And he is learning from his grandmother, not the other way around. All right. So if you missed 23, just make sure you're going back and maybe annotating the text ahead of time to understand where each piece of the text is happening, right? If you can find the paragraph where he talks about his grandmother, a question like 23 is really easy. If you can't find it, it's a question that's really hard. All right, so question 24 asks about the comments that Garcia Marquez makes about his fame, right? Um, so this is ultimately a detail question, right? When we see something like indicates, that means we are looking for it directly in the passage. So where does Garcia Marquez make claims about his fame? Well, we see those claims right here, right? So in this paragraph, we see the quote here. So we want to see, what does the passage say about this quote? What does this passage say about this, right? So it says that he made these jokes as witty and complicated acts of gratitude for a destiny that the writer was sure could have been different. Okay. So it seems to suggest a destiny that he was sure could have been different means his life could have unfolded in a different way, right? How do we know that? From this quote. Okay. So now while this is a complicated act of gratitude, it still nonetheless is gratitude according to this passage. This question 24 is not asking how do you interpret this quote. It's asking how the passage interprets this quote within those lines from 45 to 50. All right. So deserves more credit. He doesn't. That part is certainly wrong. Okay, for D. Best work has yet to be written. Unclaimed. Accomplishments are distorted by others. Unclaimed. All right. So when we go there and we find that complicated act of gratitude, question 24 is pretty straightforward. Just make sure you're going to that paragraph. If you missed this, you probably want to be annotating the passage more as you go through it. All right, so question 25 is pretty straightforward. It asks, why does he think he might have become something better, right? Now, again, this is a little bit of an ironic statement, right? He doesn't really think he would have been better necessarily to have been a character in one of his unfinished novels than to not. Now, where do we see the answer to this question? Right here. If he had stayed, underline in this blue, if he had stayed in his isolated birthplace of Aracataca, Colombia. So if he had stayed in Aracataca, Colombia, then he could have been one of the characters in one of his novels that he would have never written. All right. So just make sure you're going to the lines and finding that. We know he did, in fact, complete his journey to Acapulco. We know he couldn't have written this novel sooner because he didn't understand the style. And we know that he didn't take his fame super seriously. He kind of liked to make fun of it. So just make sure for 25, a detailed question like this, we're going back to the passage. All right, so question 26 is a good one because there's a lot of really good little bits of distractors here. So the passage author indicates that Martin's biography helps provide a little bit of balance to Garcia Marquez. So what is that balance? Right, so we see that right here, okay? When we look at this, it says that it is a um, good way of balancing out what we see here, joking cheerfulness and elaborate ironies. All right. So that's directly in the passage, and it directly connects to answer choice B. Now, there are some things, though, that we might be compelled by in this. Okay. So, for example, 26, refusal to write about life's tragedies. Refusal is too extreme, right? Um, the belief that darkness has its compensations, both Martin and Garcia Marquez agree with this, right? It's not that it's something that Martin is undercutting. Then finally, A is just strictly really not supported whatsoever in the text. So B is correct because it's directly in the passage, but an answer choice like D is really hard to get rid of until we realize that refusal is too extreme of a word, making that answer choice, in fact, a distractor. All right, so 27 is probably the easier question here. So master is referring to one person on in this passage. We see in line 83, it says we can return to the master if we get too depressed, right? Ultimately, the master is the person who is the subject of Martin's biography. Who is Martin's biography about? Well, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. All right. So these other answer choices are what we would call recycled language distractors, probably. The passage author definitely isn't the master. That one would be insane. Imagine you're writing an article and you're like, they call me the master. Okay, it's too much. Martin is the writer of the biography. Okay, so if we're returning to the master because Martin's biography is sometimes too sad, well, you can't return to the thing that you're already reading. And then Kafka might be a master, might be someone who's masterful, but is not the subject of Martin's biography. So that's how we arrive to D for this question 27, which ultimately ends our third passage here on ACT 495. With that, we'll move on to the other passages. We'll move on to passage 4 and go through every question for passage 4. So passage 4 is one of our more straightforward passages in terms of its structure. There's a lot of kind of interesting stuff in here if you're interested in geography or science or anything like that. It's a pretty cool passage. In order to understand the passage, I think the most important thing that you could do is do some cursory annotation to just mention what is being discussed in each paragraph. All right, this passage moves structurally in a chronological fashion, meaning we're starting at our earliest date and moving forward in time. And as our passage moves forward chronologically, we are additionally expanding out the scope and size of our maps. All right. So the oldest, we have the most limited sense of scale, the most limited distance. And as we get further into human history, as we get closer to our present, we find that our maps and our sense of scale increases and increases and increases. So where do we see this? Well, 25th century BC, so almost 3,000 or almost 6,000 years ago, we see our first, kind of clearest early map, which is about 30 acres in size, right? Later on, we see here with early Greeks that, we don't have any understanding of scale, but then we see kind of, again, a little bit more of thoughts, a little bit, we get map makers from Anaximander, but again, we're still not seeing scale. All right, so this would probably, you'd want to say, earliest and maybe no scale. right there. So a little bit of annotation is going to help you out there. Now we get to this second paragraph and we see something really interesting, okay? We see that Eratosthenes, a geographer, a Greek geographer living in, well, maybe he's just has a Greek name. He's living in Alexandria in Egypt. All right. From the Library of Alexandria, he is able to estimate the size of our planet, the Earth, using the fact that on the summer solstice at noon, we have a definitive, direct, perfectly high in the sky sun, and that at noon on the solstice in Alexandria, we have 7.2 degrees from vertical, 1/50th of a circle, right? Which suggests that we live on a circular planet, and therefore the distance between Alexandria and Syene, the town where the initial reading was made, is going to be 1/50th of the size of the planet, right? Which we see here. So then using camels as an estimator to determine how much distance was between Alexandria and Syene, Eratosthenes makes the first notion of scale of the size of the planet, which was only 15% off from the modern measurement. Okay. So next we move. So this basically is where we get, I'd put scale of Earth, right? Next, we get our first scale of solar system. Okay. So now we're starting to talk about what is the difference, the distance between planets. So we have jumped ahead almost 2,000 years from the 3rd century BC to the 17th century Common Era. All right. And we see that we now are able to figure out the distance from Earth to the sun, right? And the distance from Earth to other places using, again, kind of these calculations using far-flung areas. So we now get a scale of our solar system. In our next passage, now we're getting the scale of our, we'll write it over here, the scale of our galaxy, okay, which is calculated by Isaac Newton. And, it's kind of a throwaway accomplishment of his because he accomplished so much, but it's unfathomably large. Now our scale in the course of 6,000 years has gone from about 30 acres and no notion of ultimately how big our planet is to 10 trillion miles and are, something that would be far beyond what we could understand. Now we have finally, according to this passage, gotten to a scale that we cannot comprehend, right? Going at the speed of an airplane, it would take 5 million years to reach our destination. Going at the speed of the fastest rocket ship ever manufactured, the trip would take 100,000 years, right? So ultimately, we have kind of an unfathomable distance now between us and our nearest star. So as the passage moves on in time, we increase in scale. Okay, so that's this natural science passage as a whole, and then we go ahead and get into the questions. Okay, so if you missed question 28, I'll just put it bluntly to you. Watch the review of the passage as a whole. It is the video right before this one. And guess what we talk about? The organization of the passage. Okay, so talk about directly. So I'm just going to mainly focus on the distractors. What makes each answer choice that's wrong, as opposed to going through the passage as a whole, because I already did that. So A is probably a really compelling distractor if you're focused on chronological account, right? There is a chronological account here, right? We go from the earliest to the latest. But is this of our attempt to determine the distance of the stars from Earth the whole time? No, that's too specific, right? We're talking about the scale of the planet at certain points, a map of a farm at certain points. it's only at the very end that we're determining the distance of stars from Earth. So while it's chronological, we only have one attempt at that, and it's coming at the end. Um, B, perfectly correct, right? We see, a series of examples explaining larger and larger distances measured, right? Starting with a plot of land across a river all the way to the distance to the nearest star. All right. C, while there is a step-by-step explanation of the calculation used to measure, or estimate rather, the Earth's surface, we can get rid of that word measure, right? That's wrong. And more importantly, is that what this passage is, actually doing? Is that how we could best describe this? Certainly not, right? It's focusing on more than just the Earth's circumference. And then finally, maps of the universe. Okay, well, yes, kind of, but is this a collection of anecdotes? No, right? And are these really maps of the universe? Well, the known universe maybe at one point was just your world, but I think that that's too reductive. So we're going to go with B here. But again, if you missed this question, most importantly, watch the whole test overview in the preceding video, the video right before this one. Okay, so 29, we're being asked just about the first paragraph. Okay, so you can only focus on this first paragraph. Some issues here. So example, Eratosthenes. When does Eratosthenes show up? In the second paragraph, right? When did we conclude that the Earth was curved? In the second paragraph, right? Ancient Greeks' contributions to astronomy. Okay, we do get that a little bit, but we also are getting all this stuff about a clay tablet from Irkutsk, and other things like that. We're not only talking about the Greeks, we're also talking about the ancient Mesopotamians. So that's definitely not a summary of the ancient Greeks' contributions to astronomy. So there's something wrong with A, B, and D. Now, C, we could say, yeah, we've gone from thinking about, 30 acres in size, that human civilization's maps have gone from, maybe a city all the way to a notion of, right, like as much of the world as we can possibly create or envision. So that's how we get to C for question 29. It introduces the topic of the passage as a whole. All right, so question 30, we're talking about the models of the universe in this particular portion of the first paragraph. You'll either have the lines underlined or highlighted or somehow designated to you if you're taking this digitally. Why is it B? Why do we know that they provide no scientific estimates of size or scale of the objects that they're identifying? Well, that's exactly what it says, right? We see no understanding of scale already underlined, right? No estimates of dimensions, right? And then again, no estimate of size, right? So all of these references from here to here, they're definitely considered, but they're giving any insight into how big these things are. So that's exactly what B says. Okay. We can get rid of A because there's a portion that says that they think the universe is finite. All right, so it's not infinite, it's finite. Okay, we can't say all of them think that. Surprisingly accurate, that's what comes up later. Okay, so that's not at this point in time yet. And then finally, for only the Greeks do we hear this notion that the people who developed them position their homeland at the center of the universe. We don't see this in any of the other examples provided in that paragraph. So, remember, this is one similarity among all of these ancient ones, not just one that is present in one single one of them. So that's how we arrive to B for question 30. Okay, so 31 I don't think is a very tricky question unless you are kind of running out of time on this passage, which is what often happens on the ACT if you spent too much time on earlier questions. So the main idea of the last paragraph is to do something. Okay, so we go to the last paragraph and we see that all of this is about the scale of a star compared to our nearest star, right? It is a distance unimaginable, right? Even today, nothing in our experience allows us to relate to this distance. Okay, so ultimately, A quotes that same thing directly, right? That is the thesis of that, or the topic sentence at the very least, of that final paragraph. Okay. Does the distance to the nearest star seem small? I, don't think that 100,000 years of flying at the fastest rocket ship ever is small, right? That is long as hell. Okay. Um, that this distance to travel has only been calculated recently. This is true, but is that the main idea? Certainly not, right? The time it would take is something that isn't even actually true. It's both hypothetical, right? Could we actually take an airplane for 5 million years? No. How would you refuel? Can you actually take a rocket ship for 100,000 years? No. And then D, the nearest stars are more distant from the Earth than Newton predicted. That's just simply incorrect because we see that Newton correctly concluded the nearest stars are about 100,000 times the distance, right? 10 trillion miles away. Right, so that is ultimately how we arrive at A for question 31. All right, so if you missed 32, I think you just misread the question stem or you ignored the question stem. All right, this question says, based on the passage, so it's a detailed question. It's going to be verbatim in the text. To calculate the distance between Syene and Alexandria, Eratosthenes did something. Okay, so the curvature of the Earth he needed in order to calculate the size of the Earth, right? In order to understand maybe the size of the Earth, he maybe had to do something of B. C, he doesn't necessarily need the height of the sun, but if he wants to calculate the size of the Earth, he needs C. But do any of these have to do with the distance between Syene and Alexandria? No. How did he figure out the distance between Syene and Alexandria? Well, he knew that camels could make the trip in 50 days and that they could cover about 11 and a half miles in a day. So using 100 stadia over 50 days, he then knows how far Syene is from Alexandria, which would be, 50 times 100. Always read the question stem. If you missed 32, you just probably didn't read the question stem. Right, question 33 is what we call a detail question. This word indicates, demonstrates that our answer choice is going to be directly in the passage. So the passage indicates that astronomers could not calculate the distance from Earth to other points in the solar system until we had a certain technology. Where does the passage say this? Okay, we could not calculate the size of our telescope until we were able to we could not calculate the size of our solar system until we waited around until we got the invention of the telescope 2,000 years later. All right, so directly in the text, we waited for the invention of the telescope in order to calculate the size of our solar system. All right, so it is a direct detail question from the passage, right? So all these other things don't have to do with what the text says about when we were able to start to measure the solar system, which happened once we invented the telescope. All right, so 34 is a little bit of a caveat buried in this paragraph about Newton's calculation of the distance to the nearest stars. But notice here in this paragraph here, Newton managed to estimate the distance to the nearest stars. And then there's a non-essential phrase, which of course we need to read because we're in the reading section, so every word is important. Only someone as accomplished as Newton could have been the first to perform such a calculation and have it go almost unnoticed among his other achievements, right? So basically, his other achievements all dwarf, according to our author, the scale of achievement that he got by calculating the distance of stars, right? So that directly suggests that it is less acknowledged. All right. We know it's not more speculative because it's true, right? It was direct. He used math to determine it. It wasn't it wasn't just a simple kind of guess. It was a mathematical proof, okay? Or not proof, but attempt at figuring this out mathematically. It's not less complete. I mean, it was accurate. That's not less complete. And finally, it doesn't suggest that his calculations are more important. It suggests that his other work is more important. So if you chose A, you might have flipped the logic of this question stem. But D is the one that is directly related in the text right here. All right, so that is how we get D for question 34. All right, so 35 is one of those ones where I think the best way to arrive at the correct answer is by getting rid of answer choices that are just simply not related whatsoever in the passage. So, did it take a long time for Newton's calculation to be deciphered by other people? No. It was revealed the moment, according to the passage, he published his Principia. Okay, so B is wrong for that reason. C is handwriting and oak galls and a quill pen dipped in ink. Is that an artistic flourish? No, his handwriting is not an artistic flourish. D, did he make a number of mistakes according to this passage? No, he arrived at the correct calculation. So the only answer choice that has nothing wrong with it is A, right? We know that he did have an old-fashioned writing method, right? He's using spindly handwriting with a quill dipped in ink. And then he definitely had an advanced calculation because even though he was hundreds of years ago, it was perfectly correct. So A has nothing wrong with it. B, C, and D have something wrong with it. Always go by what's wrong in order to get rid of answer choices. All right, so 36 is one of the very rare vocab word and context questions on the ACT. Remember, on the SAT, we see as many as 10 to 12 on every test. On the ACT, it maybe is 2 or 3 per reading test. So as used in line 70, the phrase set out most nearly means. So we go to line 70 and we see if we set out for the nearest star beyond our solar system at the speed of an airplane, it would take 5 million years to reach our destination. All right, so to set out in this case means to leave, right? To go on. So started a journey, to set out is perfect. Okay. If we put described a vision, that doesn't work there, right? If we described a vision for the nearest star, it would take 5 million years to reach it. No, that's not leaving. If we stated a purpose for the nearest star, are we giving a purpose for the nearest star? No, that doesn't make sense. Then finally created an arrangement, doesn't make sense either. I'm assuming if you missed this question 36, it's really a consequence of being on the final passage of the ACT reading and ultimately kind of running out of time. If you missed this question, your mistake wasn't on 36 necessarily, but more so you probably spent too much time on some questions earlier in the test, maybe this passage or maybe earlier passages. Maybe you spent too much time reading and didn't have enough time to answer what ultimately is probably one of the easiest questions on the test, or to devote enough time to answering it. So that would be my concern here. And with that, we are at the end of our ACT 495. Thank you for going through this with us. And remember, every single question is up here. It's been a pleasure. And best of luck in all your test prep endeavors here at Hamilton Education.